Number 2, oh my God, it's an Isaac Tiemens at number 10, and he says, if you could have one astronomical object appear as large in the sky as the full moon and visible to the naked eye, what would it be? Well, first of all, since this is an astronomy question rather than a personal taste question, I hate to break people's expectations of this, but if you were to put something spectacular like the Orion Nebula, let's say, we've all seen the pictures of the Orion Nebula, or at least you've seen pictures of these gigantic, enormous clouds of gas, and they're reds and purples and greens, and they're light years across. These giant, beautiful nebulae. Well, if we put the Andromeda, if we put the Orion Nebula, let's say, I may have said Andromeda earlier, I meant to say Orion. If you put the Orion Nebula right up against a point where it would be as large in the sky as the moon, you would not see this beautiful red detailed structure. You would see a gray smudge. I'm sorry to break it to you, but that's the way it is. The Milky Way, if you take a time exposure to the Milky Way, resolves itself into all these beautiful little pieces of, little areas of dust and stars, individual stars, globular clusters, planetary nebulae, and all the rest of the nebulae and so on. But it's too faint to see in that detail. You have to do a time exposure for that. So that's when every time you see like a Star Trek show or something like that, and you see people flying through these nebulae, and it looks exactly like they do on the Hubble. Well, no. I'm sorry to be the person who breaks it to you. They're very faint, and getting closer to them doesn't make them any more sharper or brighter. And the reason we know this is because we sit in the middle of the Milky Way galaxy. We sit in the middle of it. It's like a pancake that we're baked into, and it goes all the way around the night sky. And when you look at it with the naked eye, it's a gray blur. It's a pronounced gray blur in dark sky, but it's a gray blur, and any kind of light, it pretty much disappears. So that's what any of these nebulae would look like if you brought them close enough to be the size of the full moon. Obviously, the answer wants to be Saturn, because Saturn is, in fact, striking. First thing I ever saw through a telescope was Saturn, and I was done. I was hooked after. It was this big in the viewfinder, but it was in the telescope, little telescope. It was an unbelievable experience. So certainly Saturn stands up. But my first inclination is I'll just go with it just because it's an interesting question. If you could see the orbits of the moons of Jupiter, they would be bigger than the full moon right now. At the distance of Jupiter, if you look at the full moon in the sky, it covers about, I want to say it's about 3 degrees. I've forgotten. Honest to God, forgotten what the full moon diameter is. I'm ashamed of that. But in any event, the angular width of the full moon at its orbit, or the moon at any point, full or not, because the moon stays the same size more or less. If you've got the moon, let me try this a little more simply. If you've got the moon in the sky, and next to it you've got the bright dot of Jupiter, you cannot resolve Jupiter. You can't, with the naked eye, you can't see the disk of it. You certainly can't see the clouds on it. However, if you could see the orbits, of the Jovian moons, they would be wider than the moon is, significantly wider, because Jupiter is its own solar system. That would be kind of cool. Otherwise, I'd go with Saturn. And I'm hearing from Ash37 here that he looked at nebulae and so on with a telescope, but that's entirely my point. First of all, looking at it, I've looked through powerful telescopes at nebulae, and you can see a lot more detail than you can with the naked eye, but it is nevertheless a gray smudge. And it's never more than that. It may be a relatively bright, relatively well-resolved gray smudge, but it's a gray smudge. And it doesn't get better when it gets closer. The Magellanic Clouds are 2 galaxies that orbit the Milky Way, and they're gray smudges too. I've seen them in the southern hemisphere. Anyway, I think that's probably the answer, Zechariah. Obviously, I'll just take the easy answer and say Saturn, because it is, in fact, the most spectacular thing that scales up. Actually, in the real world, that's kind of a cool way of saying it. Saturn, of all the astronomical objects out there, is by far, and I'm speaking as a guy now who worked in an observatory for the public over 6 or 7 years. Saturn is by far the one celestial object that performs. When you look at Saturn in a telescope, it does in fact knock you on your ass. Boom! It's unbelievable. Jupiter, you can see occasionally you see bands around there, and you have to learn, averted vision, all the rest. Mars is generally a disappointment in a telescope, and the moon is spectacular, but it's monotonous and blindingly bright. But Saturn pays off. Saturn is the only thing I've ever seen through a telescope that was more impressive than the pictures. The only thing. And nothing else comes close to it. Interesting question, though. I love those kind of questions. All right, let's see what we got here. That was